Welcome to All Home Care Matters, the show where we discuss all things home care, with discussions on important age-related matters and topics. Brought to you by Enriched Life Home Care Services, the #1 rated home care provider in Michigan by Top Rated Local.
Hello, and welcome back to All Home Care Matters. If this is your first time visiting us here at the show, we want to say thank you for taking time out to be with us today. We appreciate how valuable everyone's time is, and that's why we try and make each episode here at All Home Care Matters something that will hopefully matter to you. Today, we are honored to welcome a dear friend of the show and board member to All Home Care Matters and the founder of the Whole Care Network, Christopher MacLellan. Welcome, Christopher.
Well, greetings, Lance. It's nice to be on the other side of a podcast for a change. So
Yes.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, and I should also mention you are a board member of All Home Care Matters and a valuable part of the team, so we appreciate that. And we
I'm honored
appreciate
to be a part of it. Thank you.
Absolutely. It's our pleasure. And it's also a remarkable resource that you are providing the families and caregivers with the Whole Care Network.
Well, thank you. And I think we all, as caregivers, we all want to find that path to advocacy, especially after caregiving has ended for myself. And I just find that podcasting is just one of the great ways to share stories, because it's through story sharing where diversity meets the road to collaborate on a common cause. And our common cause is supporting caregivers.
Yes, yes. And you started the Whole Care Network, if I understand correctly, from your experience as being a caregiver.
Exactly. I was fortunate when my partner, my now deceased partner, Richard Schiffer, was diagnosed originally with esophageal cancer. I kept looking for these, I needed an outlet. I wanted to share my story, and I was fortunate where I found a place to share my story. And then as time progressed, Richard made his life transition. I wanted to continue to be an advocate. And I thought that podcasting was really the best tool to do that, because it's personal. You get to hear your voice, you hear your story, and people hear your story in your own words. And what started out as kind of a little hobby has now grown into something that, one person really can't run by themselves anymore. And that analogy with caregiving is so prevalent. In order to be a caregiver, you need to have you need to have a team behind you. Well, in order to progress with the Whole Care Network, I need to have a little team behind me as well. But we'll get to that sooner or later.
Yeah, and I just wanted to touch on your story because it wasn't just a personal story per se, because your story has been read by over 500,000 people now. What do you think it was about your story and Richard's that just resonated so personally with readers and people?
A couple of things, Lance, and thank you for letting me talk about it, because it's everything that I do today is in memory of my partner, Richard. And I think what connected people to our story is they could put themselves in our shoes, dealing with the medical system, dealing with the legal system, the anticipation of loss that was coming down the road. The story just ended up happening to be about two men. The orientation side of it really didn't matter to people because they could put themselves in our shoes. And the other thing, and the comment that came back, the other thing that was so interesting, our story was, it was a caregiving story, but it also was a love story, because we were just two people that completely opposite, one Jewish man, one Catholic fellow, but we just connected, and that resonated through the story and the videos that the Sun Sentinel did. And I'm so grateful for the journalist who followed us, who, they got attached to us as well. Well, who wouldn't? So, but I'm very grateful to have this special memory of Richard through the story, because I understand our story is no different really from any other caregivers. The struggles, the joys, the disappointments. We just had our story published, and it was another way that people could connect with the reality of life, regardless of sexual orientation or religious beliefs, or because when you get right down to it, Lance, caregivers, no matter what side of the fence you're on or what your religious beliefs are, or your economic standard, people just want to care for the person that's entrusted with their care as best as they can.
Right. Well, and I know in the healthcare system, and there's kind of, I guess, a correlation you can make. When you go into an emergency room, they don't look at anything other than why you're there, right? They don't look at, demographic information, geographic, financial, first do no harm, right? And so, those things shouldn't necessarily matter when it comes down to we're human beings and we're trying to take care of this person and get them better. Kind of similar to your story, like you're saying, it didn't really matter about the orientation or that it was two men. The point was you were a caregiver and he needed care.
Exactly. And that's why people were able to connect with the story. And I often had people ask me, I've had people continue to ask me, what's different for LGBT caregivers? And I would always say, and I say this very honestly, not much. We, like I said earlier, we all just want to love and care for the person that we are entrusted in our care as best as we can. But, I'm not naive either. I understood that there were differences for us. That's why I carried a green folder with me wherever I went that had our healthcare proxies, our power of attorneys, our living wills, in case we ran into a problem. But, that was few and far between. But those same documents are things that everybody needs, not
Right.
just a same-sex couple. And, while the legal and medical playing field has leveled out with marriage equality somewhat, we all need those documents. It's not just for one segment. Everybody needs to have those important affairs in order. And that's another reason why the story resonated with people, because Richard and I were able to have those conversations. I knew exactly what he wanted. And when time came for him to make his life transition, I did not have to doubt any of my decisions because I was following his wishes. And that made a very stressful day just a tad bit easier because I didn't have to worry or wonder, am I doing the right thing? My partner, my companion, my best friend had just died, and I'm getting inundated with all these questions. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? So, well, I knew what he wanted because we had that conversation. And I hope people, as they feel comfortable, have those conversations with their care partner, their loved one, because it does make a difficult day just a tad bit easier when it happens.
Right. And and I've often found too with the families we help, you don't want to have to make those decisions in a moment of panic or crisis either. Because then you're making it and you might not be making the best decision, but because you're under pressure, you make a decision you may not have if you had done it under a more calming environment.
Yeah, there's so many people, and I say this in jest, they're having these conversations in the back of an ambulance on the way to a hospital in the middle of an emergency. And it's like, and I understand these conversations are difficult and they're not, they're not easy to approach. And especially when you're dealing with, let's say, parents that you might have had baggage with over the years, or siblings or your spouse. But somewhere along the line, you either you need an objective third person, or you need to find that comfort zone in having these, because if you don't, somebody else is going to make those decisions for you, and you're most likely not going to like any of those decisions.
Exactly. So what was your background before you became the bow tie guy and the whole care network guy?
My educational background's in social work and theology. And I think the analogy of what's going on with the whole care network goes back to my first job in social work as a director of an information and referral line for Catholic Charities in St. Louis, where people would call in and there'd be an emergency situation. It could be anything from, I'm thinking of suicide, to what time's mass at the cathedral. So it was the gamut, but it was giving accurate information and referral to people who were in need. And I got to throw in, Lance, that this was in the time before there was computers. There were all Rolodex, and we look at maps, and we got into computers right in the early '90s, which was fun. But I started out with the Rolodex, and now that the information and referral mindset has really transferred to me as I create and work through the philosophy of the whole care network.
So when you first, reading your story, I've read it a couple of times now, just refreshing for today. Richard had family, but in the big picture, he really didn't have family. Is that fair to say? So
It's fair to say.
you were his family, you were his advocate. Mm-hmm. And what did you like? How did you adjust? How did you tackle and move forward? It's kind of one of those things too, where when you're kind of, when the rubber meets the road, you just do what you have to do. I understand that. But how did you navigate your way through becoming his full-time advocate and caregiver? And because if you don't really have a background in, hands-on care with another person, it can be overwhelming and a little intimidating. How did you find your rhythm and your routine?
Well, I think my background in social work helped quite a bit, and I also had been involved in non-ordained ministerial services centered around senior care.
Okay.
So I had a little bit of advantage, and I also like to tease my siblings since I'm the youngest of six. And there's a big age difference with them. Said I've been trained well to take care of older people, but that's I hope they're listening to get.
I hope so too.
I was kind of fortunate that I had a little bit of knowledge of how the system worked, and I have the personality to where I don't really have any problems asking questions politely. If I don't know something, I'm gonna ask. I'm not gonna leave something for chance. And especially when you're entrusted with the care of another human being, which I think personally is the greatest honor that anybody that is bestowed on any of us. Some people are better at it than others, but we all try to do the best as we can. But I think my background in social work has played an advantageous role for me as becoming a caregiver advocate for Richard. Yeah.
Was there any things that you encountered that you needed to go and find help for, resources for? What would you recommend to families who may just be starting this caregiving journey and they don't have that benefit of being in social work or in the healthcare field or having had take care of somebody in the past? How do you best advise they move forward with finding that support and help?
Well, that's a great question, Lance, because if I look back to when Richard first got sick and we got the diagnosis in 2011, and we jump ahead now 10 plus years, the information that's available to caregivers now is 10 times more than what was available then. The internet has changed the way that people can discover information. And I'm going to kind of answer your question just a little bit differently. It's because there's so much information that's out there. You want to find a trusted source. You want to find whatever that is. And that usually comes from somebody that who's done the role before. Because we can look up all the different resources, but usually it's going to be that referral that comes from somebody else. But here's the difference that I like to tell people, and I know, and I you've probably heard me say this before, but in the 10, 11 years, 12 years I've been involved in the space, I've not met one person that's had caregiving on their bucket list of things to do in life. It's an unplanned event. Nobody plans for an emergency.
That's true.
But if you could be just a tad bit proactive, and especially we have an aging society, but caregiving isn't limited to just seniors.
Right.
But you kind of be a little proactive, be aware of what your resources is. Know what's like your closest hospital. Talk to your physician. take that step to be a little bit more proactive. So, because when that emergency happens, and unfortunately they always do,
Right.
then you're just a little bit better prepared. But I think in general, society as a whole today is more aware of the caregiving issue because it's much more out in the open than it was just 10, 11 years ago.
Absolutely. Right. And there's still a lot of work to be done.
A lot of work. This is an issue that's never going away.
Exactly. And
Think of it like this. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, you're good.
I'm usually the host, not the guest. So
host away, Christopher.
But think about if every caregiver in the United States, and AARP estimates that it's 53 million. I think that number is kind of low because people still aren't self-identifying. But think if every caregiver just for one day went on strike and decided that they were going to take their care partner, their loved one, to the emergency room or an adult daycare center, or they were going to drop somebody off at the office as a home health care. What would happen to the healthcare system? It would crash.
Yeah.
Because the caregivers are the backbone of the American healthcare system.
Absolutely.
And it's time for us to be recognized.
I agree 100%. And I will say, too, I am very hopeful that and I want to be careful how I phrase this because I don't want to put a positive light on the pandemic of COVID. But if there was to be anything positive that came out of such a disastrous, horrific situation like the pandemic, it's that it has shown the need for a stronger foundation for the healthcare system as a whole, because you saw all over the place. I know at least here where we're at, they were popping up literally tents in the middle of the mall parking lot that they were creating to put hospital beds in. In the East Coast, and I talked to our friend Marianne about this on a previous episode, they bring in a hospital ship from the Navy and dock it there in New York for the overflow. That's nothing compared to the amount of seniors and people with disabilities or special needs that are having family caregivers in their home every day. You just said, 53 million, and that number's probably low. Where's the support for them, these family caregivers? Because there's also an economical effect to it as well.
And I think you just said the most important word in this conversation, the economic value. Right. Because when you can tie a social issue, and caregiving is a social issue, to the economy, that's when decision makers start to take notice.
Yes.
That's when insurance companies start to take notice. So, and that's when people start feeling a little bit more comfortable in sharing their story. So it's kind of like, you've got people on both sides of the aisle. Let's just use a political. You got people on both sides of the aisles. Maybe they're not talking to one another, but you know what? They're both caregivers, or they're caring for their spouse, or they've got a common. They've got a common purpose, and they recognize through that story of theirs that there's a need. And then when they tie it into the financial component of it, this is an important issue. It's not just a social issue. I'm more on the social side, so I'm gonna do because that's just me. But in order to get legislative work, which is happening and has happened, you have to have these decision makers connect it to what the impact is on the economy. And that is one of the biggest changes that's been going on here in the last 3 to 4 years.
Yes, and hopefully there will be more changes to come. I know they're working on many different bills and different possibilities, but as we all know, bureaucracy does not move quickly. It's a very slow process, and sometimes
my beard might be down to my navel by the time all that happens.
Or we both may end up having hair, right? So
I like our barbers, though.
Right. Yes.
So out of this remarkable story of you and Christopher, there's another exciting thing that is in the works. Do you want to share what that is?
I do, thank you, because this is just now that's happening. Very grateful that a film script has been written about our story. And the working title of the film is My Green Folder. And people ask me, well, why My Green Folder? Well, you got to read the story for one thing, but
Right.
I carried a green folder with me wherever I went that had all of our important documents in it. And that really is that's not the full theme of the film, because again, it is kind of a love story, but it does talk about why it's important to have the documents, why same-sex marriage is, it can be controversial. I understand that, but when you tie it in solely to the civil benefits that marriage provides, especially at the time of death, because most people don't realize, again, it's those conversations we don't have. Every state of the union, your next of kin at the time of death is your spouse.
Right.
And if you're unmarried, it doesn't matter if you're what side of the orientation fence you're on. If you're not married, you could be out in the ocean without a paddle and not have any rights to that person who you've spent the majority of your life with. So that's why I'm so grateful to have this opportunity to tell our story through a film, because again, it will resonate with people because they can put themselves in our shoes. And it just happens to be about two men.
Right. What are some of the feedback you've received from your story? Any that like really stand out? Because I know you got over half a billion people or 500,000 people that read it and still counting. So you've probably gotten a lot of comments, a lot of emails, but are there any stories or things that really stand out above all else?
There's a couple of comments that were short and to the point that I always remember. And one was, heterosexual couples wish they had a loving relationship like this, and signed by a heterosexual woman.
Okay.
And then another one that rings out is, I'll get emotional on this one. People fall in love with souls, not bodies.
Yeah.
And that's, as opposite as he and I were, I mean, that's kind of what I miss about him, is the soul. And then, it kind of comes back to another comment that was just resonated throughout all the, I can't remember how many comments there are, but it talked about why, all the comments talked about why did this have to be a problem? And I don't know, I don't have the answer to that,
Right.
because everybody has their personal beliefs, and I respect that. I mean, I spent 5 years in the seminary, 6 years in the seminary. So I understand different people's beliefs, and I respect that. But, when it comes down to love, care, and commitment, those are three words everybody understands.
Sure.
Everybody wants to experience them. Everybody wants to feel them. And, Richard and I could have been your neighbor. That's the common theme about all the comments and the stories and our story, and it just resonated with people. And there was not. Now here's the story about this: the Sun Sentinel who did the article. They were ready for some backlash,
Okay.
and it didn't happen. They didn't get negative calls. A reporter got a few minor negative emails about it. That, as I've learned over the years, now reporters get that no matter what.
Sure.
They could write the sun as yellow, and somebody could say, "No, it's not. It's orange."
Absolutely. Yeah.
But all in all, this the comments was so positive, and it's like, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for recognizing that love, care, and commitment is infectious.
Did you ever get any pushback because of being in your state? Did you ever have any issues when you were going to medical appointments, or when the time came you had to make decisions?
There actually early on in the process, we got a little bit of pushback. So, for instance, we were in the emergency room, and two doctors come in, and Richard's laying in the bed, and they're just pumping him with questions, and I just kind of spoke up. I said, I might be able to help you out here. And they turned to me and said, well, who are you and what are you doing here? And then it happened a little while later where we went down for a test in nuclear medicine. And the tech asked me, who was I and why am I here? So, that normally wouldn't happen if it was a man and a woman. Mm-hmm. You normally wouldn't be asked about your role. It's just kind of assumed. But all in all, the relationships that we had with our physicians were across the board. And now anytime we had a new referral, I'd have my folder with me and I'd go through it. But, I was always conscious of the fact that somebody new on our care team was going to question, because that just was the sign of the times then.
How did Richard respond and handle some of that? 'Cause he seems a little more feisty.
Yeah, our personalities were a lot different. Where I'm a little bit more judicious, and he's like, I don't, he just didn't care.
Yeah.
And I guess, you get to the point where, there was 20 years difference in age, and he was a tough New Yorker. I mean, he was 5'4". He just, he said, you can't, this was one of the lines in the story, and this is something that he would say, you can't discriminate against me because I don't really care what you think.
I don't care. Yeah.
Now, there was a couple of different words that would probably put in there. Sure. But that's how he lived his life. I mean, you think of that era of LGBT seniors that grew up in fear of losing their job, fear of, because at that time you could be put in jail for being who you were. And then, I think kind of growing up in New York is a little different than growing up in St. Louis.
Right.
But he just he just didn't care what other people thought, and he wasn't afraid to tell you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I kind of, there's some days I wish I kind of had that, but maybe not.
Yeah, right. That's good in some situations, maybe not in others. Yeah. Right. Did you ever discuss starting your mission in honor of him, with him?
Well, actually, yes. He a couple of things on that. We started a blog together. My original blog was called The Purple Jacket, and that blog is still up. I haven't touched it in years, but it's like a memorial. But that's how we started online together.
Okay.
We would, we'd do updates about his condition, and we would always sign it. We might have cancer, but cancer never had us. And he would love to get in and look at what people are asking or saying. We developed an acronym for him called TLO, the little one. So he loved that, and we were on a couple of podcasts together. When you think about in 2013,
okay,
we talked about end of life issues, what his expectations and what he wanted. He talked openly about how he was feeling. That would have been January of 2013, and he was feeling pretty good up at that point. But he had known that that as the new year was coming on, he says, I just wish I could have felt as better as I did the year before.
Okay.
But when I look back and listen to that podcast, and I've had to listen to it here recently because of the film project, and
Sure.
to hear his voice and to recognize the things, and to remind myself that what I didn't recognize when we were in the middle of this, how his health was deteriorating. Because like a lot of caregivers, you see our care partner, our loved one every day. You don't recognize those subtle changes.
Right.
But when I go
Mhm.
back, I can see. I said, "Oh, goodness gracious, Saint Ignatius, he was really sick."
Did he keep, do you think he kept some of it from you too?
Oh yeah.
Just to, for your benefit?
Well, for my benefit, and I want to make sure I say this correctly. Not only for my benefit, but for his as well, because it's hard. It's hard to admit that you need help.
Yeah.
And if I can just diverse here for a second and give you an
Please.
example.
Yeah.
I was one of those caregivers that always wanted to overdo. I couldn't do enough for him. That became of the love, I'm sure. But he was fiercely independent, and he wanted to do as much as he could do until he couldn't. And then fast forward 2-3 years ago, I started having some heart issues, and with atrial fibrillation. And I eventually had an ablation procedure, and I just recently had an implant to monitor my heart. But after the ablation procedure, I needed a caregiver. I needed help getting into the shower. I needed help getting dressed. And I thought I knew a whole lot about caregiving. Man, I wrote a book. I've got the blog. I know I have the best advice. I mean, I gave it to Richard every day.
Yeah.
But until you need a caregiver, you don't really understand what it's all about.
Right.
I didn't. I used to think, now why didn't he take my advice that day? Why?
Yeah.
I have such good advice. Why didn't he do it? Well, it's kind of like when I needed the caregiver and they wanted me to do a couple of things. Let me help you into the shower. Oh no, I could do it. Well, and where I'm going with this is I was able to get in touch personally about what it's like not to be able to do things that you're used to doing,
Right.
and why it's hard to accept the help that you need. It's just given me a whole different perspective on the role of my role as a caregiver. And I haven't been able to articulate it precisely yet. I'm still working on that, but it's that internal feeling of knowing that your capabilities aren't what they once were, and that it's hard to admit that.
Right.
But you got to find that happy medium in saying that it's okay to ask for help. And now I understood 100% why there's days he just wanted to do things on his own, because that was a way for him to give him some assurance that he could still do.
They'll do it. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think that's as I move forward with a couple of new projects, that's going to be kind of my theme, because, there's, and I think we've talked about this before, there's two very common aspects to caregiving. There's a beginning and there's an end, and we're not prepared for either one of these life-changing events. And as I talk about life after caregiving, and there's a pretty good chance I'm probably going to need a caregiver again down the road if I continue to have these flare-ups. Yeah. But I want to be mindful about, making my decisions and collaborating with people and being open and honest about what my capabilities are. Yeah. Because that's going to help. That's going to help the care partner.
Absolutely. And, just to touch on it, like Rosalind Carter, her famous quote about caregivers, you're either needing a caregiver, will need a caregiver, are a caregiver, or you have been a caregiver. It touches everyone. And I just want to thank you so much, Christopher. You're a dear friend. And I say this in all sincerity, a remarkable, remarkable person inside and out. And you're such a wonderful asset to caregivers everywhere in the caregiving community. And, it's a real pleasure of ours to be friends with you. So thank you so much.
It's my honor, Lance. I'm just a guy with a story
And a bow tie.
and a bow tie. It's there.
Yep, there it is.
I promise. I need a beard shave, but
And we will have the links up to your story, your site, and everything here in the show notes. And you, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you do have a trailer or a teaser coming out very soon for the film, correct?
there's a trailer that I recorded myself for the film. It will be available on mygreenfolderfilm.com. It's available on the Whole Care Network as well, and my new upcoming brand that's debuting next week in Italy.
Wonderful.
Aging Gayfully.
Okay. Yep. And we'll have links to all of that. And last question before we leave. Who plays Christopher and who plays Richard in the film, if you could pick?
Well, if I could pick, I would think Danny DeVito would play Richard.
Okay.
And for me, only because I like him as an actor, Jim Parsons from The Big Bang Theory.
Okay. All right. Yeah. That'd be a really good combination. Do you have any, I know that I said the last question, but now this is the last one. Is there any timeline when you're thinking the film may get production going and released?
Well, right now it's in the script is in the hands of one producer. We're testing the waters with producers and directors across the country who might be interested in taking this to production. But we're at the good thing is the script is the script is complete. It's ready, available for anybody who wants to preview it. And I will say this one thing about this script, Lance, and I felt like while reading the scripts and while I was involved somewhat in the production, where there was a main screenwriter who did this, I laughed, I cried, but most importantly, I felt like I was having another conversation with Richard. The screenwriter captured his personality because we had so much rich content from his voice, from the story, that I know if this gets in the right hands, it's going to be very successful.
That's wonderful.
And this is my final. It's not my final gift, but then I'll probably take it up more time. But
the ultimate gift.
One of the things Richard always wanted to do was he wanted to work in theater.
Okay.
And he wanted to work on Broadway, and I always used to tease him. I said, imagine that, a Jew working on Broadway. and he would laugh because we had that type of relationship. But if we were able to get this to film, he'd be tickled to death about this, because that's the industry he always wanted to work in, and just wasn't allowed to by his father. So it's another honor for him to be able to do this. Yeah.
Well, and the work you do every day for caregivers is honoring him too.
Thank you.
It is. Well, thank you so much, Christopher. And I know we'll talk again, and I just wish you well. You're getting ready to go overseas, so safe travels to you.
Follow me through Aging Gayfully. It's going to be fun.
There you go. All right. And we'll have the links up on the site and on the show notes, and we'll have you back when you get back, and maybe we'll have some exciting news about the film.
Sounds like a plan.
All right. Thank you, Christopher.
Thanks, Lance.
Thank you for joining us today here at All Home Care Matters. All Home Care Matters is here to help families as they navigate these long-term care issues. We invite you to visit us at allhomecarematters.com, where there's a private, secure, fillable form where you can give us feedback, show ideas, or if you have questions. Every form is read and responded to. And remember, you can listen to the show on any of your favorite podcast streaming platforms or watch the show on our official YouTube channel. Just make sure to hit that subscribe button so that you never miss an episode. We'd also like to thank our friend Christopher MacLellan for joining us today. Thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you next time here at All Home Care Matters.
Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to you joining us again on another episode of All Home Care Matters. To learn more about the show and to connect with us, visit us at allhomecarematters.com.